My name is Chris Garcia. I am a fellow in this year's System Design and Management program, and I am sponsored by the Department of Pathology at the Massachusetts General Hospital, where I'm also a fellow in pathology informatics. At MGH, I work on operational and research projects that focus on initiatives that include digital pathology, computational pathology, clinical informatics, and cognitive environments as our department strives to move the field forward. I joined the incoming class of SDM students after we saw value from working with the program on one of our initiatives last year. I received a BS degree in biology from Arizona State University, my medical degree from the University of Illinois, and I finished my residency in anatomic and clinical pathology at the University of Utah. On top of my education and work at MIT and MGH, I am a medical advisor to the Digital Pathology Services Group at Philips Healthcare, and I sit on the Strategic Advisory Board for Sunquest Information Systems. It is my distinct pleasure this morning to introduce Dr. Coleman to you. Dr. Todd Coleman is an associate professor of bioengineering at the University of California, San Diego, where he directs the Neural Interaction Laboratory and co-directs the Center for Perinatal Health. His research is highly interdisciplinary, sitting at the intersection of bioelectronics, medicine, and machine learning. He is conducting research in digital health by wedding his research group's expertise in large-scale analytics with its recent development of epidermal electronics, featured in Science in 2011. Dr. Coleman has been named a 2015 Gilbreth Lecturer by the National Academy of Engineering and a speaker at TEDMed 2015, an independent health and medicine edition of the world-famous TED Conference. He is a science advisor for the National Academy of Sciences Science and Entertainment Exchange, and his research has been featured on CNN, BBC, and the New York Times. He received BS degrees in electrical engineering and computer engineering, both summa cum laude, from the University of Michigan. He received MS and PhD degrees here from MIT in electrical engineering. He also conducted postdoctoral studies at MIT in neuroscience. It is my great privilege to ask you to join me in welcoming Dr. Coleman to the stage.
Thank you, Chris. So you can see, this picture here is a picture of my college buddy's wife, Rana, and she was pregnant with twins. And while she was pregnant, very early on, at about 7 months into her pregnancy, she started to have massive uterine contractions, and they had to take her to the hospital and put her on bed rest, worried about the babies being born very premature. And so one of the things that we've been thinking about is, why is it that this has to happen? Take a look at if you take a look at the look in her face, she appears very stressed and she has to go to the hospital to be monitored. Are there opportunities that we could facilitate this to be done at home? And so that sort of motivates the theme of our research group that lies at the intersection of sort of being able to allow people to be untethered so that they can be monitored, that information can be, let's say, transmitted wirelessly to a smartphone, then uploaded to the cloud so that that data can actually be used to help make better decisions, either directly to the user or to pass information on to a doctor. And as Chris alluded to, the perspective that we have on this did not come overnight, but rather it began with my graduate work here at MIT, working with Professor Muriel Medard in the Department of Electrical Engineering, where I learned a lot about applied mathematics. I was very fortunate that Muriel strongly encouraged me to take a postdoctoral study in something wildly different before starting my career. And so I did a postdoctoral study with Emory Brown, who is here at MIT and also practices medicine at Mass General Hospital. And that's when I began to learn about medicine and how to intersect the applied mathematics with medicine. Very fortunate because Emory has a PhD in statistics as well. And so when I started off my career at the University of Illinois, I began to get interested in these ideas of untethering people, removing the wires. So we established a partnership with John Rogers, who is a certified genius. He's a material science professor who also won the MacArthur Genius Award. And so together we developed these systems that Chris alluded to, these flexible electronic systems that integrate right onto the body. And what's very interesting about these, you take this random walk and you bounce around to the right, you bounce around to the left, But what's interesting is that these things generate a lot of data. So it takes me back to where I began my training, and how do we turn this data into information, and ultimately how do we use this in clinical settings to really allow people to be untethered, to test the efficacy of these, and ultimately try to marshal this forward. So I'll tell you a little bit about our foray at the first step. And the starting point, if we think about Rana when she had those belts on her body, why is that the case? Well, it's primarily because the human body is very soft, right? Skin is curvy, linear, and elastic, but electronic circuits are built on wafers, which are rigid, planar, and brittle. And so the question becomes, can we have any type of in between? And so it turns out that we can, and what you can do is you can take these wafers that we typically fabricate electronic circuits on, and you can develop clever procedures to peel off just the top layer, and you can integrate this onto things that are flexible, thus accomplishing flexible electronics. And so this sort of, fast forward and, subtracting a lot of the details, you can build systems that look like this, which are flexible body integrated systems. They go right onto the body. Blow a picture of one of these devices. You can allow them to be multifunctional. You can put antennas on the devices. You can measure a variety of things such as how much light being illuminated. You can have these things deliver light with LEDs. You can measure strain. You can measure temperature. You can measure electrical signals. So here's the type of data that we could demonstrate we could pick up. You can see things such as an EKG. You can see things such as skin temperature that could be relevant if you're thinking about someone who might have an infection, or you can monitor things like electrical rhythms of the brain. And so in the process, as we started to build some of these things, one of the challenges began to be actually trying to massively fabricate these things. As I moved to University of California, San Diego, I sprinted towards the medical school, established lots of partnerships, but the bottleneck ended up being, how do we make these things? And so this picture that you see up top, I don't expect you to understand the details. The punchline is that the traditional way we fabricate these things is very complicated. And so we wanted to obviate the need to go through all these different steps and develop a much more clever approach. So the idea here is that necessity is the mother of all invention. And so it turns out our graduate student day indeed was able to do this. And what you can see in this is that there's much fewer steps. And crucially important is that you don't need to dip these things in any type of chemicals anymore. And the nice thing about that is that it actually allows us to remove these devices from the wafer with any type of adhesive, such as a piece of Scotch tape. And so if you fast forward and think about that, and we think about scale, not only demonstrating these capabilities, but being able to build them at scale so that we could get many people to use them, you think about things like the Industrial Revolution and the invention of the printing press. And so we began to ask ourselves, well, could we do similar types of things? And so we also tested this on a lint roller, and what you can see is that we can peel these things off of the wafer just with a lint roller, which is allows us to begin to flirt with the idea of how you could have massive roll-to-roll processing. And indeed, that's the case. There exist, different types of machinery in industry that can do roll-to-roll, and so we're exploring facilitating this now. Takeaway lesson being, we don't just want to build these sensors, we want to think about being able to build these at scale to try to really attempt to have impact. Now moving forward, we don't want to just have these sensors embedded in like a piece of Band-Aid or a Scotch tape, but in addition, we want to have integrated circuits. And by that, I mean, we need to take the signal, we need to amplify the signal. Ultimately, we might want to transmit it wirelessly. Those things require integrated circuits. Now, do we want to be designing those circuits ourselves? No. We want to de-risk this to all the smart engineers at Intel and Texas Instruments and other places. So my other graduate student, Yunsung, has developed a very clever procedure to take existing chips made by other people and integrate them into flexible materials. And ultimately what you see here in the bottom right, this is just a piece of Tegaderm, and I have one of these on me. It's a medical adhesive, FDA approved, made by 3M, and embedded inside of there we have not only sensors, but also integrated circuits. So that gives you a picture of how we're thinking from the perspective of building these devices. But these things just generate data. How do we actually take this data and turn it into information? And so that's crucially important as well to help facilitate a better decision making and ultimately better health outcomes. So in that regard, I quote Michael Jordan here. And so Michael Jordan has a quote in a recent article where he talks about the importance of when we do data analysis, we have to be very careful while not only finding the most likely explanation, but also quantifying uncertainty. And what I mean by this is if you just, think about your undergraduate statistics class, take a look at these two curves here. These two curves have the same maximizer, and that's that red dot. So imagine you have a bunch of data, you're trying to find the most likely explanation that corresponds to the red dot. But you don't know if you're on the blue curve or the green curve, right? And the difference is that one of them has quite a bit more variability than the other. And so especially in these medical decision-making situations, we want not only the best explanation, but also we want to quantify uncertainty. We know how to do that with small data. It's not as obvious how to do with big data. So don't listen to me saying this. Listen to Michael Jordan, where he says, and I quote, I think data analysis can deliver inference at certain levels of quality. We have to be clear about what levels of quality. We have to put error bars around our predictions. That's not Michael Jordan, the basketball player, saying this, Wake up, everyone. It's Michael Jordan, the world-famous statistician at UC Berkeley, who chaired the National Academy's report on big data. Right. So that's Michael Jordan, the famous statistician, saying this. And so this has been in the back of our mind for a while. So my graduate student, Diego Mesa, has been taking some approaches where, again, we really like these ideas of walking on the shoulders of giants. So it turns out that a lot of companies like LinkedIn and Google, they have all of these algorithms to basically find the red dot with big data, right? So that we know how to do, but we don't know how to quantify uncertainty. So could we take approaches where we could use their existing algorithms as a starting point and build upon them and actually quantify uncertainty? And it turns out that the answer is yes. And so we can do that until we can actually tell you exactly the whole curvature or exactly everything that's going on with uncertainty. And indeed, we're very fortunate that Google and Amazon have given us space on their cloud to actually test out our algorithms to do that. And one example about the improvement that you get with uncertainty quantification is just in an intensive care unit setting, trying to predict whether or not someone is going to survive or not in an intensive care unit. The red curve, what you see, is the famous ROC curve, type 1 errors versus type 2 errors. And the blue curve is what you get when you use our approach. And you see that the area under the curve is superior in the blue approach. It's the exact same data, but it's that we're also using uncertainty quantification, and we can do this at scale with large amounts of data. So those are some of the things that we're thinking about, and I'd like to bring to your attention a gentleman named Jonathan Rothberg, some of you may be familiar with, who made lots of money in the gene sequencing revolution in the late 90s. And so he sort of changed his attention, and he's pointing, he's interested in some of these new technology developments that are taking place. And so here's an article that appeared in the MIT Technology Review in November 2014. And long story short, there's a new Stanford professor that has some new way of making these little ultrasound devices that are compatible with CMOS manufacturing, which means you can really densely integrate them and scale. So you can envision in the future that you can basically take your cell phone and basically wipe it around your abdomen, and you could get very nice imaging about what's going on and maybe detect cancer earlier on or detect other types of problems. And so he's got lots of people in Silicon Valley very interested in this. And so we began to scratch our heads and always ask ourselves, skating towards where the puck is going, let's assume that these types of things will exist. What are the unintended consequences, or what are the unmet needs? So one of the unmet needs, and in fact is already manifesting itself right now and will even happen more so when we take a look at these emerging technologies, is the following. If we take a look at the Internet of Things, wearables, things along those lines, things that are very small, miniaturized, that generate a lot of data, the typical way that the story works right now is they acquire data, they digitize the data, they wirelessly transmit it to the cloud, then in the cloud that data is turned into information to facilitate good decision making. Now we think that all makes sense, except there's a couple of caveats here. One of which is that the sort of wirelessly transmitting the data eats up a lot of your battery. It's kind of like when you have GPS on in your smartphone and you see the energy in your battery, the energy on your phone going down quite a bit. Another issue is that if we're moving data back and forth to the cloud, if we want to make very rapid decisions, we're going to be limited by the delay in moving all these bits around, right? There's a speed limit at how fast bits can be moved back and forth. Not to mention, in addition, data is not free. Moving data back and forth costs money. And so what we got interested in is saying that maybe this approach of doing all the analysis in the cloud is not superior for all applications, but can we explore other types of scenarios? And so my graduate student Marcella has been exploring taking some of these new emerging miniaturized chips that literally are supercomputers. And so what you see in this picture right here, that little green-looking board right there, is a system called Parallella, and it's the world's most energy-efficient supercomputer. Right now, it's the size of a credit card, and they're miniaturizing it more and more. They're going to put this inside of the Internet of Things, inside of wearables. Many companies are pursuing this now. So what this begins to mean is that we can start to get very energy-efficient, number-crunching capabilities, and so we can integrate this right with where we acquire data. And the nice thing about that is that we can make the time to making decisions much faster because we're not exchanging data back and forth to the cloud. Only when necessary, periodically, do we send data to the cloud. This has the great potential to reduce energy consumption, and not to mention we get an extra benefit from a security perspective, right? Your data is not being managed in the cloud. So this is just one of these scenarios of how we think skating towards where the puck is going to how we engineer our systems. So I hope that begins to give you a flavor of how we think from the level of building these technologies, doing the data analysis, and I'd like to go into some clinical applications now. And we're very fortunate at UC San Diego to have an Institute of Engineering and Medicine where we basically have a collection of centers inside of this institute. It's a campus-wide institute. Every center has to have a co-director who's a practicing physician in the School of Medicine, as well as an engineering faculty member. And so we got very interested in the perinatal period, which basically is the window of time corresponding to pregnancy, newborn baby, et cetera. And so I can tell you about one project with Sandy Ramos in reproductive medicine and myself. And the high-level story is that, if you remember my college buddy's wife, Rana, let's think about trying to validate our technology within that context. And so what we have going on is a study where we're looking at women in labor at the hospital at UC San Diego in labor and delivery, and we simultaneously put these patches on the abdomen. So we do a validation study, and let's compare the type of data that we can get with conventional technology compared to what we get with ours. And here's just one picture of a waveform, and what you can see, and the red represents what was collected off of one of these clunky belts, and the blue is what we estimate from our flexible multi-electrode sensors and some appropriate algorithms. And this is done with our postdoc, former postdoc, Sheila Rosenberg, who's now the director of research at a rehabilitation hospital outside of Los Angeles. And so you might ask yourselves, well, you know, what are the potential implications of this? Well, hopefully this picture kind of makes that clear. There's multiple aspects of this, one of which is if you take a look at Rana here in the developed world, let's say it was a complicated pregnancy, maybe not during labor, but let's take a look at throughout, you know, the 7 months into her pregnancy. If she has a high-risk pregnancy, we can allow for her to be monitored remotely without needing to go to the hospital in the comfort of her own home and alert the physician when necessary. But in addition, if we think about in the developing world, where there's more smartphones than there is running water in many areas, you can think about opportunities for right during labor where maybe a midwife is helping to deliver the baby. This information can be relayed to a doctor 1,000 miles away. And so this is the high-level vision of what we're pursuing with this application. And we're moving forward and doing this not only in labor, but also with antenatal testing. So another application within our Center for Perinatal Health is with Tina Chambers, who is in pediatrics, and myself. And what we're doing here is we're taking a look at now these babies. Let's say they were born and we were fortunate to keep them in the womb for as long as possible. Or let's say the babies were born prematurely. If they ended up at the neonatal intensive care unit, one of the questions that we might want to ask ourselves is, are the babies still going to have cognitive outcomes that are productive and that are normal? And so asking these types of questions about what is the development going to be like for the baby is a very important question, because just like in cancer, the earlier that you can identify a problem and intervene, the better the outcomes. So the standard way that they take a look at this right now, let's imagine a baby that was born premature. Let's just say that the mom was drinking during pregnancy, so you know the baby may have fetal alcohol syndrome. There's a limited set of clinical experts that do this. Doesn't really scale. And what they do is they go in and they snap their fingers and do a variety of tests and watch how the baby's eyes move. And from this, they build a subjective assessment of the baby to determine whether or not they think they will develop normally. So what we got interested in is seeing if we can do similar things with data. And so what we did is a very simple paradigm with Tina and some of her collaborators, where you play a sequence of sounds, beep, 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 beep. You abruptly change the frequency or the volume of the sound, and it turns out that your brain is very predictive, and your brain will determine, aha, there's a change. That grabs attention from your cardiovascular system, so you can just monitor the heart rate. So you monitor the heart rate of the baby while you play these sounds, and on that third tone where there's a change, you're supposed to see some differences in the heart rate variability. So my graduate student, Diego, took this data and overlaid it with the data that we got from the physicians, where we basically determined, is this baby going to have a normal cognitive development or an abnormal cognitive development? And by applying appropriate analytics techniques, he can get about 80% predictability by playing a sequence of sounds and recording heart rate variability. Now, what's very interesting about that is if we think about scale, this is something ideally that could be done potentially with a smartphone and your favorite Apple Watch or whatever device that can monitor heart rate variability. We're in the process now of doing some thorough testing on this and validation in those types of settings as we speak. So if we fast forward a little bit, these applications or the use of the types of things that we're doing apply not only in the early stages of life, but also within the context of aging. And so in that regard, if we take a look at aging for a minute, what we see are, in many situations, people's posture starts to change. They start to have stoop posture, shaky hands, chronic pain starts to become a problem. So one example of this, let's just think about Parkinson's disease, where we know there's over 6 million people worldwide, no cure. Very much like I mentioned with the assessment of the babies, the reference clinical score is subjective. It's called the UPDRS score. And there's a sort of an unmet need for quantitative diagnosis and treatment assessment within the context of aging broadly, and more specifically here, as I mentioned, Parkinson's disease. And so one of the things that I did is I partnered with some smart undergraduate students at UC San Diego. So these two gentlemen right here were in a senior design team. One of them now is a medical student at Stanford, and the other is a grad student at Johns Hopkins, our competitor institution. And so I got them together, and we partnered with some physicians at UC San Diego that look at movement disorders and whatnot. And in getting together, we did some very simple things, such as, let's not even think about any of our wearable patches. Let's just get something like a Microsoft Connect. So we got a Microsoft Connect, and we wanted to just say, let's take a look at movement information from a Parkinson's disease patient. And so at least what we're doing now is we're quantifying the kinematics as a Parkinson's patient is involved in this test that the clinician simultaneously is doing subjectively. Now we can collect this type of data, and what's interesting about this is that this applies not only to Parkinson's disease, but for a lot of situations in aging where there's stoop posture. Can we quantitatively describe this and then provide suggestions on how to improve posture, or to determine if there's any type of deterioration, efficacy of different types of medication. And where we're going with this, here's a variety of things. Here's just one example where we can do things like build real-time posture classification. And so basically what we did is we got information from one of our clinical colleagues that to determine sort of what a good and a bad posture is offline. And then in real time, while we're collecting data, we can code that as normal or abnormal. And this has important implications, not only, let's say, for Parkinson's disease, but in this situation, having real-time classification is particularly relevant. As we age, we become more injury prone, and it's very important that we sort of determine, are we engaged in injury-prone types of postures or behaviors, and if so, to be notified of that as rapidly as possible. So that's kind of a unique application there. And so with these types of things, what we're doing now is we're integrating movement information, which could come visually, from something like a Microsoft Connect or from one of these wearable watch types of devices. It turns out with a lot of movement disorders, it turns out your voice information can tell us a lot about the deterioration of posture, movement disorders, so on and so forth. And also, not to mention, electrophysiologic information can tell us a lot about stress, about fatigue, deterioration. And so what we're doing is the same type of idea as before, where we take all this data and we turn it into information. And this is a fun project with multiple clinicians, including surgeons, movement disorders experts, graduate students, undergraduate students. A really fun project. And another application of this that we're now pursuing is virtual rehabilitation. What I mean by that is, let's imagine that a loved one had a stroke, and one of the biggest issues, as we know with stroke, is that the rehabilitation afterwards. You typically get very limited amounts of time for which you can go to the doctor to get rehab, and they always encourage you to do these exercises at home. But it turns out you're very prone to be doing these exercises wrong. And also your loved one. Let's imagine your wife is helping you with this. So with some of this visual technology, with some of these wearables, can we actually take this data and to determine whether or not you're engaged in these exercises correctly? So you can have the effect of getting rehabilitation, much more, good rehabilitation, but still at low cost. And so it's a fun application with some, animated gaming types of ideas, real-time animation to provide you feedback. And this is done in collaboration with some rehabilitation experts at UC San Diego. So at this point, maybe what you guys are thinking is, wow, these guys really, they solved all the problems, right? They've got, everyone lived happily ever after, right? So, they've got the technology development, they've got the analytics, and they're partnering with clinicians. And, it's very important to be humble and to always keep your eyes out to make sure that you're not missing something really important. And so one of the epiphanies that we had is, some of you may know this gentleman named Dean Ornish, who's a world famous physician at UC San Francisco. He's basically a guy that over 30 years ago was the first person to really come up with the idea and to really test the idea that you could totally reverse cardiovascular disease just by behavioral modification without the need of taking any drugs, any stents. All the cardiologists thought he was crazy, but little by little, he did these studies, got more and more data, partnered with world-class people, Nobel Prize-winning scientists, and now he has over 30 years of evidence really showing that by lifestyle modification, you can totally reverse many aspects of chronic disease. He's now gone further to say not only for cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and recent work even in taking a look at prostate cancer, if I remember correctly. So he spoke this year at the Davos World Economic Forum, and if you haven't seen him speak, I strongly encourage you to take a look at the video. You can find it online. And so he has this paradigm that he talks about, and it basically has 4 pillars. And one of them is nutrition, another one is fitness. These 2 are somewhat obvious, but the other 2 perhaps that are not as obvious are things like stress management and things like love and support. And so as I began to take a look at this, we started to ask ourselves, well, can we take this current workflow of how we're thinking and facilitate those 4 pillars? And the more you think about it, the reality is no, you can't, right? It's not just a technology play and an analytics play and getting information to the doctor. There's some other sort of dimensions to this that we have to think about very carefully. Especially, love and support, stress management. How do we think about this? And how do we get this to really persist and to be sustainable? And so, I've got some friends. So, for example, Mike Smith, who is a PhD director of the Intel academic program. He did his graduate studies at Carnegie Mellon University. And so while he was at Carnegie Mellon University, he partnered with a cardiologist. And they began to focus specifically in the African-American community that this cardiologist served. And they found that a lot of these people, she would bring them in, tell them, hey, you have cardiovascular disease, you're at risk for having a heart attack, for worse things to happen, and she was just not having that much efficacy in this approach of kind of warning them, and if you don't change, bad things will happen. And so they had this epiphany to think about, well, what if we were to partner with some of the big African-American churches in the Pittsburgh community? And so Mike partnered with Augustus Brown, who's the chairman of Mercy Acts International, which is a nonprofit organization that's connected to many churches worldwide. And the interesting thing about these churches is that in every church, there's typically a healthcare worker there, a nurse or something like that. And so they partnered and they created health coaches that came from the churches. And one of the things that we know about churches is that they're a very trusted community. And not all of us may know this, but different communities don't have the same level of trust in their doctors, right? If you think about African Americans, Tuskegee experiment, right? So on and so forth. So if you have people from your church, from your community that live in the same neighborhoods as you, that are encourage you to engage in these lifestyle modifications, it can have more efficacy. And so they got involved with the study, you know, got Verizon to fund it. You see why Verizon would want to fund it, right? Verizon's thinking, hey, if you wear these things, you move this data, the data plan. So Verizon funded some of these studies, and the idea is to take some of these existing wearables, moving data around, but more importantly, getting people to adopt and use this, and having the health coaches inform them about the importance of this, because a lot of us don't really even understand what it means for our blood pressure to be this, for our EKG to be this. So begin to understand this is what this means, and these are the consequences of some of the decisions that you make when you eat this versus that, when you don't exercise compared to when you do. So one of the things that was remarkable is that they had just some very basic ambitions, like can we get people just to measure themselves more, to get a better understanding? Well, it turns out they far exceeded expectations, created a network effect. There began to be a little bit of what I call co-opetition. So people were, you know, working with one another, but also competing with one another. And so people at church on Sunday were saying things, well, how much did you exercise? Well, what did your device say? And how much weight are you losing? And so to make a long story short, people reduced their blood pressure, people lost weight. It was very, very effective. And so these are the types of things that, that I'm beginning to embrace in conjunction with a lot of the other developments that we do with our research group. Here's another example, Tiffany Paul. Tiffany Paul I went to college with, turns out. She was always brilliant. She was a chemical engineering major with a 4.0 GPA and pre-med. So fast forward, she's now an MD and an MPH, and works at the intramural part of the National Institutes of Health. And she's spending a lot of her time, it turns out, coincidentally, on similar types of things, and taking a look at what some of the social determinants of obesity and cardiovascular risk. And so here's a quote from an article that came out about some of her recent work called Zip Codes and Waistlines. Location, location, location. So it turns out that if you take the same people and you just move them to different neighborhoods, that has a huge effect on their health. So you've got the same education, the same job, moved to a different location. And so they talk about how much weight that you gain. And so one of the things that Tiffany is now beginning to speak to is, also beginning to educate the physicians about getting them to understand that you can't just tell someone that they need to change their behavior. You have to think about the environment that they're in, what kinds of resources that they have, and think about other clever ways to engage people. And it turns out, coincidentally, great minds think alike. What is she doing now? Well, the next thing that she's doing now in Washington, D.C., and we're beginning to partner with her, is partnering with faith-based communities to educate their members about effective diet and lifestyle changes. And so I think that increasingly, technology and all these other things are going to be there, but we're not going to see these changes unless we have this human component of engaging people about the importance of doing this. And so if we go back to this picture right here that I showed you earlier, let's imagine now that we're taking a look at African-American women in America. Well, not all of us may know this, but it turns out that African-American women are twice as likely to have a baby born prematurely. So it turns out the national and the world average is about 10%. It's about 19% African-American women. And there's similar stories for stillbirths, et cetera, et cetera. We still don't understand exactly why, but this is a big challenge. And so one of the things that we've been doing right here is doing a bit of community engagement in Southern California. And as you know, the state of California is unique in many ways. First of all, San Diego is an immigrant town. And so one of the things that's interesting in that regard is that we have a lot of, let's say, women who are pregnant who are undocumented. And so we're partnering with Project Concern International that works carefully with these communities to understand some of their concerns. And so, for example, if you remember that story I told about how people like to have their data and have it go to the cloud, well, let's imagine if you're undocumented, right? You might not feel so happy about that. And so what I'm really trying to say by this is, remember that picture that I showed and I gave you a technological story of how we evolved to the bottom? Well, also another part of that story was actually understanding our patient population and thinking from this use case scenario. A lot of us in the audience also are a little wary of our data being stored in the cloud. Let's imagine if you're an immigrant who runs the risk of being deported back home. This is yet another reason why you might prefer something like this. Now, another aspect of this, if we take a look at people in underserved communities, as I mentioned, the data play. If you're moving all that data back and forth to the cloud, you have a data plan, and that's costing you money. And so another aspect of designing these systems and how we think about engineering these systems is guided by our users. Let's take a look at people who perhaps need this most. In underserved communities, moving data back and forth is not free. So engineer these systems so that we do the analytics locally, only move data when necessary, sort of has that effect. So in that regard, we're also partnering with the Black Infant Health Initiative, which is a multi-decade long program throughout the state of California that's really trying to take a look at this issue of preterm birth and stillbirths in African American women and develop novel ways with people in epidemiology and public health to attack these problems. And so it's a great opportunity to really sort of think about who the users of this may be and really guide how we engineer this. And so the high-level idea of how we're thinking now, sort of fast forward, is it's not enough just to think about these technological innovations and connecting the patient to the doctor wirelessly. As I mentioned before, thinking about the interaction between the patient and the health coach, the patient and the people in their community who understand the importance of this, and working with trusted community partners such as, churches, barbershops, beauty salons, and sort of getting the word out about the importance of this and making them feel like they're a part of this. Now, some other important aspects of this that some of you might be scratching your heads about is, well, in order for this to really scale, it needs to financially kind of make sense. And a lot of us typically think that when you want to do things to benefit the underserved, that's cute, but you're not going to make any money off of this. But I'll just, give you an example. So I had a conversation with one of the head people at Kaiser Permanente. So you guys on the East Coast might not know Kaiser Permanente, but they're big on the West Coast, and they're very unique because they are a physician system, so they're a provider, but they're also an insurance company. So they're very eager to innovate because they have to think about risks on both sides. And so their headquarters are in the Bay Area, and so they have a big patient population in Oakland. And one of the things that the gentleman was telling me is that what they find in Oakland is something like 75% of their patients only show up to the doctor when there's an emergency and show up in the emergency room. And so if you take a look at the cost that's being incurred upon them, it's huge. And so they're very eager to develop clever ways to get people to be involved in lifestyle modification, seeing a doctor more regularly. And so there's some very unique opportunities that we're beginning to explore on the level of recruitment, retention, compliance, and integrating this with the healthcare system. And some of you may be aware that this is already happening. There's many insurance companies now that will actually pay for you to have a wearable, because if a small percentage of you use this and get engaged in better lifestyle modification, I forget the number, but every pound that you drop is a savings of X amount of dollars for your insurance company. So as much as we think that targeting the underserved communities is kind of cute, but it's not financially viable, I think in this situation, this is definitely not the case. Specifically for pregnancy, and a lot of us might not be aware of this, but pregnancy is one patient group where pretty much 100% of the people can be cared for with insurance. What I mean by that is that if you don't have your own insurance plan, Medicaid understands the importance of a woman getting prenatal care, and so it's very easy for you to get treated with Medicaid. So the state of Ohio, turns out, has the worst black infant mortality rate in the country. And we've been in touch with the chair of obstetrics at Wright State University. And one of the things that he was telling us is that they have quite a few women in Dayton, Ohio, with Medicaid. And they go out of their way to engage these women to come and get prenatal care. But they don't, for a variety of different reasons. He says in part because he's a 50-something-year-old white guy trying to engage this community. And again, there's these issues of trust. And so we're exploring how to partner with them. But one of the other things that he told me that's very fascinating, let's imagine that I'm Medicare for a moment. Medicare, Medicaid, I'd be very interested in paying to incentivize people to do this for the following reason. If there's an adverse outcome during pregnancy, baby's born premature, they end up in the neonatal intensive care unit, that is one of the most expensive places in a hospital. They just charge an arm and a leg, in part because who doesn't love babies? Who doesn't want to save babies? But the more babies that you can keep out of the neonatal intensive care unit, there's a huge, huge saving. So this is just another example of how targeting these underserved communities and being savvy can relate to making and saving money as well. So that's the high-level story that I'm trying to tell. And so what I would like to do at this point is to thank some of our partners in this endeavor. From the technological side, we've been supported by people like Intel, Qualcomm, our neighbors in San Diego, as well as Broadcom right up the street. At the hardware level and at the software level, I think, as I mentioned before, we've been supported by Google, Amazon Web Services to test some of our algorithms out in the cloud. We're very fortunate that UCSD has a new hospital that's being erected, and it turns out it's going to be the biggest and the baddest hospital anywhere in Southern California, including Los Angeles. So we call it the Jacobs Medical Center. So some of us might not be aware of this, but Irwin Jacobs, who did his graduate studies and started his career here at MIT, Irwin Jacobs is also known as the godfather of wireless, the co-founder of Qualcomm. And so what's very exciting to me is that my grad students and I used to shoot the breeze and say things like, imagine if Google were to build a hospital. Imagine all the amazing, cool technology and data analysis and integrate that with cutting edge with medicine. Well, Irwin Jacobs is putting his name on this billion-dollar hospital here in San Diego, and he represents wireless and technology. And so we're very excited. This is opening in 2016, and so some of these things that I talked about are exactly the things that will be explored. I'd also like to thank Kaiser Permanente, as I mentioned before. We're interacting with them about some of these issues of their patients, but also they're allowing us to get some data from them. There's some very interesting challenges in being both a provider and a payer, and so there's some fun opportunities there. And I'd also like to thank Airstrip. And Airstrip is a company based in Texas and in San Diego. Some of you may have heard of them at the new Apple event that just occurred about 2.5 weeks ago. They got a 4-minute slot because they have an ability to mobilize data, HIPAA compliant, right onto the Apple Watch. And in particular, one of the things that they showed was pregnancy monitoring for women at home, self-administered directly to an Apple Watch on the doctor, seeing the traces of the fetal heart rate and the uterine contractions. So you can find the video on YouTube if you like. I'd also like to thank some of our traditional supporters, people like the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, and the Department of Defense, and also some foundations. The Gerber Foundation for some baby work, the Gates Foundation for some pregnancy work, as well as Hartwell and Kavli. And so as I conclude, just to sort of emphasize, our research group is indeed kind of vertically integrated, right, as I call it, or the triple threat, we also call it, because we sort of take this analytics, right, the technology development, and we connect it with medicine. But what I also caution the students in our group, and I caution the students in the audience, is that we have to be very careful, because really what those things are just paintbrushes. And what I mean by that is that they're just tools, but we have to think very carefully about the painting that we're trying to paint. And so the analogy I like to give is if Pablo Picasso were given 3 dull paintbrushes, he'd make a masterpiece. And if you give an amateur painter 3 very sophisticated paintbrushes, the painting will still be nonsense. And that story still holds for us, and sort of us having this Dean Ornish type of epiphany and sort of realizing that the story is much richer, and where the really unique opportunities are not necessarily with just these 3 paintbrushes, but sort of painting them in this broader context. And so there's a variety of things that we're doing, some of which I touched upon, including the chronic disease, rehabilitation. Patient compliance is a very important issue, getting people to make sure they take their medication when they're supposed to, and cognitive assessment. So that's the story that we're telling, and so with that, I conclude my talk, and I thank you for your attention.